Okay, so it's time to think a little bit more on the framework that Rawls has set up for us in a theory of justice. And two critics, one more sympathetic than the other, are Robert Nozick and John Tomasi. Now, Robert Nozick was actually a colleague of Rawls at Harvard. Tomasi is more contemporary. Full disclosure, John Tomasi was also my dissertation advisor at Brown University, so I'm more familiar with his views than I am of some other critics, but these are by no means the only critics, but these are critics who have offered in their own way criticisms of Rawls's views. So, not everyone has been thrilled with Rawls's approach to justice and justifying social institutions. Rawls has had a fairly deep influence in academia, and indeed, if you talk to any professional political philosopher or political theorist, they will be able to tell you whether they are Rawlsians or not, and if they're not, why. But there's different ways in which we can be unhappy with Rawls. We can, like I said in the last lecture, we can reject the method itself, that is to say, the idea of deriving justice as the product of a fair bargain, as a product of a social contract. Or we can accept the method, but reject, for various reasons, the conclusions that Rawls himself drew from his methodology. So, social justice, if you'll remember, is the notion that principles of justice can be applied to the basic structure of society. Societies are just or unjust depending on whether they meet the standards articulated by the principles of social justice. Now, for Rawls, these principles are the principle of equal liberty and the difference principle. Now, Nozick's view is that justice, unlike fairness, is always the product of human agency because it is the product of human choice. Justice is a function of how you are treated in this world, and you can only be treated in some sense by human beings. Society, or the basic structure, cannot treat you justly or unjustly because they cannot treat you at all. They are not persons or agents. Society is not an agent. Society, therefore, is more like the weather. The weather, of course, we know can be affected by what human beings do. We can have smog, and we can have pollution, we can even have global warming. But the weather cannot be unjust towards you. The weather, it can be unfortunate, it can be perhaps even unfair, but on Nozick's view, because it is not an agent, it cannot be unjust. Now, Rawls is right to say that your opportunities in life depend on the complex interactions of the basic structure of society and its different components: government, civil society, culture, and the economy. He could also be right that the way the government should treat you depends on how the other components of the basic structure are generating opportunities and disabilities for you. All of that makes perfect sense. But applying principles of justice to the basic structure is to treat an abstraction as if it were a person, as if it were real in some sense. This is sometimes called reification. We can evaluate the basic structure. It could be good or bad, but we cannot blame it for anything. At worst, we can blame the government or the people for failing to be just, but we cannot blame the basic structure in the same way. I mean, we're tempted to anthropomorphize, right? Treat as human large abstract entities and believe that they have motivations, and because it looks like they have it out for us, or it looks like they're smiling upon us. But Nozick is trying to remind us that the reality is that these large abstract entities like society don't have feelings, don't have judgments, and for him cannot be just or unjust. For Nozick, nobody even decides what the basic structure is really like. It's evolved from many disparate decisions made by many different actors. The government is certainly an important part of the basic structure, but even the government, with all its powers, doesn't have complete control over what the basic structure looks like, over how families work, over how culture works, over how the economy works, or at least it doesn't have complete control without becoming really totalitarian. Holding the government responsible for the basic structure for Nozick is kind of like holding a baseball general manager responsible for the team's performance. Up to the point, this can make sense, but beyond some point, it's really up to the players and coaches. Being a more active GM might help, but it might also backfire. Now, Nozick starts with the premise that individuals have rights and that this imposes limits on what governments may do to those individuals. Nozick wants to show that there's nothing especially unjust about patterns of voluntary transactions that nonetheless lead to the options of some people being severely limited. And he uses the example of couples pairing off on a desert island, and once 25 couples have paired off, there are 2 people left, and their option has been constrained to pair off with one another or be single, and their option has been constrained by the free choice of everyone else. Everybody else exercises their rights, presumably to associate however they wish, but this leaves a couple with not many options. For Rawls, it's not especially unjust, not for Rawls, for Nozick. For Nozick, it's not especially unjust that the pair only have 2 options. Even though you might regret it, you might think that it was unfortunate that that had to happen. But again, the couple was not treated unjustly by anybody. Their rights were not violated. They merely, unfortunately, don't have a lot of options. So, as long as the other couples exercised their rights properly and didn't collude to narrow the options of the final potential pair, no one's been wronged. And so for Nozick, he even goes so far as to saying not only is it not unjust, but their choice whether to pair off or not is still voluntary, despite their lack of attractive options, because their options have not been curtailed by any wrongdoing on the part of anyone else. When your options are curtailed on the part through wrongdoing, then you are facing an injustice. But here, there is no wrongdoing occurring. So, for Nozick, justice is a matter of how individuals treat one another. Judgments of justice and injustice apply to people. They might apply to governments and corporations, although note that governments and corporations seemingly act like agents a lot of the time, but note they also have lots of different agents within them, all of which do not share the same intentions, all of which do not share the same goals, so that even when a law is passed, it's not clear that there's a single coherent intent behind any given law. One, legislator may vote for the law because somebody included some nice piece of pork barrel legislation for his district or some earmark. Some might vote for that piece of legislation as a favor to someone else, and another might vote for it truly because they believe it will actually do something good. But at the end of the day, the law is passed, but it's not clear that there's a coherent intent behind the law. Corporations are the same thing. Corporations are large groups of shareholders. Again, they sometimes seem to act as one, but again, they may have multiple goals, maybe multiple different agents with multiple different intentions. But societies, Nozick thinks, is too far. The abstraction goes too far. Society does not act. Not the basic structure does not act. And for Nozick, therefore, the mere fact that the liberties of some people, for example, unattractive people in his pairing off of couples case, the liberties of some people are worth less than the liberties of others, is not ipso facto an evidence of injustice. Someone has to do something wrong. That is to say, someone has to violate your rights before an injustice can really occur. So for Nozick, justice doesn't really come from a fair bargain at all. Rawls has come up with a nice hypothetical device, but that device doesn't really show anything. For Nozick comes from something like the respectful treatment of autonomous agents. As long as you don't violate rights, justice is done. And if everybody respects rights, then society is just. So much for Nozick's critiques. What about Tomasi? Tomasi does not reject social justice. He rejects the social democratic implications of how Rawls works out his principles of social justice. Sometimes in political theory jargon, we say that the theory cashes out into public policies. That is to say, at the end of the day, certain kinds of public policies are the outgrowth of certain principles of justice. Tomasi simply challenges the way in which Rawls cashes out his two principles of justice. So, he's not denying that justice is the product of a fair bargain, like Nozick, but he simply denies the social democratic implications that Rawls imposes on his own view. Rawls's first principle of justice states that individuals all have a right to an equal scheme of basic liberties. This is, after all, what they would agree on in the original position. However, Rawls thinks that these basic liberties are primarily political and social, and not so much economic liberties. Of course, if they were economic liberties, then the difference principle, his second principle of justice, would constantly run afoul of the principle of equal liberty, since it would interfere with economic liberties for the sake of making the least well off as they could be. So Rawls, in some sense, has to not include too many economic liberties in the first principle if he wants any work to be done by his second principle, the difference principle. Now, Tomasi thinks that this is something that Rawls fails to argue consistently for, however. And because, even by Rawls' own admission, the first principle is prior to the second, justice as fairness may argue for substantially less redistribution and particularly regulation of the economy than Rawls thought was going to be the case. So, for Tomasi and for Rawls, this debate comes down to which liberties are more basic than the others. Why does Rawls make some liberties basic, right? We know that the first principle, the principle of equal liberty, says that everybody has a right to a scheme of, the maximum scheme of basic liberties equal or consistent with an equal scheme for everybody. So why make some liberties more basic than others? Well, for Rawls, some liberties are necessary for a government to be minimally legitimate. Without those liberties, people would not be able to freely affirm their consent to government. We saw this when we talked about political authority and political legitimacy, and we worried about what exactly was going to need to happen for people to be able to freely consent to government, right? They need to have options, probably. They need to be aware of options. In order to have options and be aware of options, you need to have something like a freedom to associate and the freedom of speech. Without those kinds of liberties, it's not clear that you are going to be able to really formulate an opinion about whether, well, it's not even clear that you are going to be able to consent to the government that you're under. So in order to have a chance at endorsing the rules for their own reasons, rather than endorsing the rules as a product of, say, indoctrination, for example, citizens have to be capable of abiding by fair terms of cooperation, and they have to be able to pursue and revise their own conceptions of the good. Now, this is a little bit technical, but this is what Rawls calls the two moral powers. Roughly what makes people rational and what makes them reasonable. The rationality is that they are able to pursue some conception of the good. And the reasonable requirement is that they're able to recognize that other people also have a right to live, and so they endorse the rights of other people as well as their own. That's what makes them reasonable. Someone who rejects that other people have equally important lives to live than their own, at least politically speaking, those people would be unreasonable for Rawls. And basically Rawls says we don't have to listen to them. Their opinion is not so important. What matters is that rational and reasonable people could consent to the principles of justice. So, the question about which liberties are basic is a question about what conditions are necessary for people to be rational and reasonable in the senses described above. And we already suggested that both Rawls and Tomasi agree that something like freedom of speech and freedom of association is going to be right in the heart of the matter. Without those freedoms, it's not clear how people can pursue a conception of the good life, and it's not clear how they could really understand what it's like for other people to pursue a conception of the good life, and so it would be hard for them to be both rational and reasonable. Now, for Tomasi, he thinks that many economic liberties should be also thought of as basic. So he provides a couple of different arguments for this. He says, as producers, what we do is often wrapped up in who we are and what conceptions of the goods we choose to pursue. A job is not merely some contingent feature about me. It's a deep reflection of who I am. So, for example, myself as a college professor, I chose this job out of many possible careers open to me. I worked very hard to become a professor. Being a professor suits my lifestyle quite well. It's got fairly flexible hours, and I have large amounts of freedom to organize my time, and nobody's really can really tell me what to do within my classroom. And so there's lots of ways in which my choice of occupation reflects my priorities in life. And to take away that kind of choice of occupation would make it very difficult for me to pursue the kind of life that I want to pursue. So it's hard to tell people that they're allowed that they should pursue conceptions of the good and formulate conceptions of the good without being able to have the economic liberty to try out these conceptions of the good. The second point he makes is that restricting economic liberty as producers restricts our ability to take control of our lives and assess different paths of life for ourselves. So I like to think of sort of occupational licensing that generally isn't there so much for the safety of people. That's usually how it's defended, but is usually there primarily to restrict a market to entrance. So think of the squabbles over Uber and Lyft, the taxi services or taxi competitors that are trying to break into the taxi markets, but taxi markets being generally licensed and heavily licensed, and licenses being very expensive. Of course, taxi companies are fighting Uber and Lyft and are trying to get them to basically trying to stop them from entering the market for, I guess, transportation. Okay. And similarly, so not just as producers, but as consumers, our decisions develop our ability to assess alternate courses of action and their impact on us. Right? So if I can't make important consumer choices that deeply affect not just trivial consumer choices, like what kind of beer am I going to buy at the supermarket, but important consumer choices, like how much insurance should I take out? How much do I care about safety versus risk? How much do I want to put aside every month? What projects will I pursue with the money that I put aside, and so on and so forth. Like these kinds of decisions are, for Tomasi, central to us being able to formulate conceptions of the good and ultimately, therefore, exercise our two moral powers. So like freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of religion, the freedom to produce, consume, and contract are essential for Tomasi to developing the kinds of people who are capable of pursuing conceptions of the good and revising such conceptions, or at least that's what Tomasi is arguing. So for Tomasi, if coercion is to be justified to rational and reasonable citizens, then the basic liberties that need to be protected are also economic. This will somewhat, but not completely, constrain what governments may do in pursuit of economic growth or reducing social and economic inequalities, because the basic liberties are prior to pursuit of material gain and also economic equality. In that sense, Tomasi he's not being a libertarian about this. He's simply saying that we have to balance different liberties, basic liberties, against one another. And so when liberties come into conflict, we're going to have to do some balancing act. It's not the case that economic liberties is always going to trump other basic liberties, but it is the case that economic liberties will trump other less priority social goals, like, for example, the pursuit of economic growth, or like the pursuit of reducing economic inequalities, because these things are not conceived of as basic for Rawls. Okay, so for example, I'll use the example of licensing requirements to be a hairdresser. That, on Tomasi's view, would be an infringement of a basic liberty. Another way to put it is it would be constitutionally prohibited, right? It would be constitutionally prohibited for states and local governments to impose licensing requirements whose only benefit are cosmetic. For instance, the preventing people to have bad haircuts, or the small chance that they might contract some kind of disease within a hairdressing operation. Those things can be handled by, say, making them post a bond. They can be handled by, perhaps competition. I mean, the point is that there's no compensating benefit. Now, on the other hand, driver's licenses or medical licensing, that presumably would still be all right, because there we're not talking about a basic liberty versus something of non-comparable importance, but we're talking about several basic liberties there having to be played off against one another. But maybe obtaining a driver's license, particularly a commercial driver's license, might become easier in some sense if economic liberty is now conceived of as basic rather than something that is merely contingent. Like, it's good if it produces good consequences, but otherwise not so good. Okay, so what Tomasi is doing here is he's conceding to Rawls in the method, but he's arguing that Rawls undervalues how central the liberty to organize one's own economic life is, both the freedom to consume and pursue different kinds of economic activity. Unlike Nozick, who rejects the notion of social justice, Tomasi accepts social justice as the appropriate criteria for evaluating societies. Tomasi simply thinks that social justice will place restrictions on the ways governments may pursue distributive goals. So he's not rejecting the notion of progressive taxation. He's not rejecting the notion that more opportunities should be provided to those at the bottom of the socioeconomic spectrum. But the kinds of paternalistic economic regulations that are sometimes put forward to help various groups in society are likely to be impermissible on constitutional grounds, even if they do achieve their goals. In the same way that public restrictions on speech and association tend to only be allowed when there's something similarly important at stake, but otherwise a lot of bad things can happen and free speech will still be respected. So that's two basic criticisms, right, of Rawls. I leave it up to you how persuasive you find either one or both. And if you have any questions, as always, get in touch.